So it's our pleasure. So hi, I'm Blaze. I'm faculty in computer science, and it's my pleasure to introduce Kathryn, also known as Kate Hymes. Kate is co-founder of the game company Thorny Games, which you'll be hearing about today. Is veteran in the tech industry, doing a lot of cool work on internationalization, humanitarian tech, and lots more, and has been a dear friend of mine for well over a decade. So welcome, Kate.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and for spending your post-lunch hour with me, though pre-lunch, because I believe that lunch is happening afterwards, vegan lunch. So yes, I'm Kathryn, and I'd love to talk with you about some of the things that we make at our studio and a little bit of, let's say, our approach to game design. But I'd also love for this to be a free-flowing conversation, so please interrupt me. I know some of you have played our games, which is really exciting. I'd love to just have you ask questions or interact, and let's have some fun together. First order of business. Yes, this works. I'm Kathryn. This is my bookshelf. So if you were to walk into my home, you would see this. This is actually a previous apartment of mine, but you would see this in a different location at this point. You see that it's color-coded. What I love to do when I walk into different people's homes is immediately hone in on the bookshelf to see what I can learn about them. One, you can see it's color-coded. I know that books are for display. I have a lot of books. They travel with me. They're part of my biography, sort of my biography of things, you could say. But if you were to look a little closer, this is what you would find. On one side, you can see bunches of language books, language tapes. This is a 4-volume Hungarian to English dictionary set I have here in the middle. This is a set of languages that I have looked at or played with, and it's a record of my time in language that brings me a lot of joy, but that may get you to ask some questions. On the other side, though, you can see a lot of the yellow stereotypical graduate math texts. And this has also been a part of myself that has followed me throughout my life. These things for so long were in conflict within me. I went to undergrad and studied math and thought that I needed to make a choice. And really throughout my undergrad, that was my choice, and kind of filled out language study in the background. And it was only when I went to graduate school, thinking that I was going to study math, that I finally kind of was able to reconcile these two paths that felt so distinct in becoming a computational linguist. And so there I can think about leveraging what is sort of a technical system-based view of the world with a deep love of languages and how they reflect on people, culture, humanity, and see what I become and what I can make from it. So Blaze has already kindly told you a couple of these things, but I figured that I would start off by kind of including a bigger sense of just who I am besides just being a co-founder of a game studio, because I feel like often we have to present like these neat and tidy stories about where we come from to get an opportunity or make ourselves legible to people, and it's a lot messier than that. This is only the very bit of mess that you can see, but you can see that this like reconcile of language and math led for me to be a computational linguist, which I studied and trained in. I worked as a technologist in many places, sometimes leveraging this to build out language technology systems, sometimes for natural language processing in and of itself. It's led me to a variety of places, and it's ultimately leading me now out of Silicon Valley into the humanitarian tech space. So I'll soon be joining Doctors Without Borders. And I'd love to talk with you, if you're interested after this, about technology and working in it, and specifically how it overlaps with games, which is the next thing that I sort of became. All of these things kind of emergently come up, but they feed into one another. So I am a game designer and a studio co-founder of Thorny Games. And one thing that I think that's interesting to hold on for a moment is just that these things aren't distinct in me, in that game design really informs the way that I look at technology design. And in fact, if you think deeply about just the systems that we use all the time, gamification and thinking about the end user as a player and an interactor with a system really permeates how many of these things are built, even if they're not consciously done so. One of the places that I worked along my path is a company called Slack. And Slack started out as a game. It's a failed game. Has anyone played the game that predated Slack? Okay, it's called Glitch. It's very strange. I highly recommend you take a look. And there's little remnants of it still within Slack if you were to look at it. But you can think of so many of the systems that we interact with every day as being fundamentally playful systems that can use sort of the best or the worst of us to drive some outcome. But here, I'd love to talk with you about Thorny Games. So Thorny Games is an analog game studio. We make games that people play in person. Sometimes they play online, but fundamentally it's trying to enable human-to-human interaction. And we are based out of Washington, DC now. I have one primary co-founder and co-designer, and his background is as a cryptographer. And that is interesting to us because I think it really informs the kinds of things that we're interested in making. Me as a linguist, I am fascinated by language as a lens on the world and people and culture and identity and all of those things, and how you can say interesting things about all of those things by first talking about language and then kind of germinating a different idea that can come to people more naturally or intuitively. And cryptography, or thinking about systems communication, secrets, things like it, is another way of just thinking about communication. And so more broadly, I think the push and pull that we bring to a lot of our designs is thinking about communication as play and playing to communicate some deeper idea. And that informs a lot of what we do. One thing I'll note here, we're real analog game designers, even though both of us come from building out technology in places. And I really firmly stand by it. So much of the time, I actually find that technology is a distraction from what can be a underlying interaction that you're trying to enable with people. And especially from a game design perspective, you can get down to these raw materials that are about story, they're about collaboration, they're about empowering people with the tools that they need to have a particular kind of experience that wouldn't be possible before. And that, I think, is actually what really excites me about story games and role-playing games. I'd love to know, what are people's experience with role-playing games? Do people play role-playing games here? I know you do. Yes. What kind of games do you play?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, just D&D, Pathfinder.
All the games,
Yeah.
Yes. Tell me.
Yeah, we also.
Awesome. Yeah. Other games that people play, storytelling games.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I really like the endless style games.
I love that too. Fiasco and the DM-less style is something that we'll get into a little bit. GM full, sometimes they call it, and all of these kinds of things. But yeah, Fiasco, I think, is a great game. Fiasco is kind of like a Coen Brothers-esque game of, forget, grand ambition, terrible impulse control, some line like that. Yeah. Anyone else who doesn't play games here? It's fine if you don't. Also, okay, that makes sense given like what this talk is about in the audience. So I think that one thing that excites me fundamentally about making things is games, the way that I see them, are building out a rule system that allow people to collaborate and connect and to make something that would be difficult to do on their own. And so in some ways, it's this real co-creation between a designer and a player that happens that is really kind of profound and fundamental. And I think there, in many forms of games, in story games and things where you're collaboratively telling a story, it is really on the surface because this is a rule system and you yourselves are co-authors of it. But even in video games and things that seem more transactional and passive, even in reading a book, everything I see, people have their hammers that they see the world in, and this is one of mine. It's like it's a system that's enabling you to collaborate or interact with it in some way. And so it's directing your attention, but also ideally enabling you to have an experience that you wouldn't be able to have without it. So why language? I know many of you here are linguists, but sometimes I talk about this with people that aren't. And naturally the question comes, oh, it seems so niche that you would have a whole game company that is primarily making things that are tinkering with language, but it works out well for us. Language, fundamental basic part of being human, and we're so wired for it. The animals don't quite do it, machines don't quite do it. Now they're getting much better at it. When we started off, even just in the last, let's say 5 years, there's been an explosive growth in what's capable there. So that may not always be the case, but it still feels like this biologically endowed technology that we have. And it's a huge carrier for our identity and culture. And I think that is what makes it so interesting as a putty, as a mechanic for gameplay. Because by tinkering with language, you're also tinkering with things that are directly informing people's personality, their experience in the world, their place in it, and hopefully will help them reflect on it in new and interesting ways. We're pretty good at it, and it's really fun to do things that you're good at. Excellence, when you're excellent at something and leaning into that is just a natural flow for people. And when it works, it can be great. And then when it doesn't, it's a real struggle. And it's full of play. You think of punning and crosswords, like this has been a surface area of play for people since time immemorial. So all of these things make it a powerful tool for game design, and it has directly been our tool in a lot of games, which I will talk about 3 projects right now. We have more outside of language, but I think these at least help emphasize a couple of ideas that I think are particular to our studio and that are interesting to think about in the wide world of games in general. So language as world building. Start off with this. Here I'm going to talk about the game that I'm passing around. I don't know where it is in the room. Oh, over there. Perfect. Game called Dialect. So Dialect is a tabletop role-playing game where you tell the story of an isolated community through their beginning, rise, and fall, say. And you do so by building up pieces of their language, their dialect. So the dialect that you kind of build out together, the set of terms and jargon that are particular to you are tied into these story beats that you create together. And what is interesting about that is that they kind of tumble together and inform one another. And by the end, you can have these story beats as manifested through bits of language that can bring you back to the experience of being in the game. This magic circle, sometimes they talk about within gaming spaces, of actually being within play versus outside of it. And it's something that is really sticky with people. That's one thing that we've found just through time, in the sense that people remember the kinds of words that they talk about. This is based on, this game is a love letter to, let's say, sociolinguistics, language change, things like it, and how language can be a reflection of identity and culture, but isn't meant for any kind of specialized audience. In fact, the vast majority of anyone who plays our games comes because they want to tell interesting, immersive, let's say, intimate and epic stories. And that's the way that we like it. We make specialized things as well, but it's great that you can approach this as someone who maybe has no interest in language, but just wants to experience story, and then hopefully come out of it with a deeper appreciation of your connection to language. One of the things that is a core part of this is you are an isolated community. What does that mean? I mean, isolation means something particular to us now. This game was made prior to the pandemic, but the idea is that you have some kind of separation from yourself and let's say an outgroup. Maybe you're physically isolated, like maybe we are playing as a bunch of people who are the first Martian outpost that has lost communication with Earth. We were the people that were sent before SpaceX in order to set up the systems and get all of the hubs up and going, but then SpaceX never came. And so maybe that's our isolation that we start with. Or maybe we are a bunch of boys at an English boarding school. And this boarding school is going to try and turn us into men on their terms, but we have our own terms for doing that and what that means. And we will go through this school together, bonding, and define our own way in the world. Or maybe we're a bunch of robots that have a last dutiful purpose on Earth that humans left us with. You can see this is somewhat Wall-E-esque, but completely not copyright infringing. That is a story that we can play out. This book, as you can see, comes with a bunch of backdrops in it that are the basis for a setting that defines some kind of isolation. And one thing that I love about this, or just the experience of making it, is that there is a rules system that comes with it, but these backdrops can be written by anyone, and the game comes with a bunch written by other people. So if there are particular backdrops that are better told by someone else because it's their story, we've invited some of them to be a part of this game, and it really runs the gamut, as you can see if you leaf through the book. But one of the core parts of this game is understanding, let's say, is apportioning control, which is a part of this. And it's going back to the point of GM-less or GM-full. The idea here is that this is a game where there's no single leader. There's no one person who is building out a world and telling you the way that the world works. Instead, it is trying to be a system that apportions out different kinds of narrative agency and let people shape it in a way that still is coherent. So there's some degree of chaos that always happens in these kinds of games, but it's controlled chaos that hopefully leads you to a beautiful, surprising place because you're co-creating something with a bunch of people. This whole section I'm framing as languages world building because it really is trying to drive home how you are connecting bits and pieces of language in this like proto-dialect that you're making to fundamental aspects of a community or a story, a backdrop. You know, for Martians, we're talking about our Martian outpost and the fact that we might be space truckers. And if we are space truckers, what is a particular form of friendship for us, right? I won't go through the mechanics of how this game works, but fundamentally, it also is trying to introduce the idea that there are, language is a way of, giving, of use and production around concepts that become meaningful to different groups of people. And so in a turn, you can imagine defining a different form of friendship that's true for our particular isolation, say, and then using that to build onto a story of us being space truckers in the midst of SpaceX shirking their duty. And in doing this, you are world building, building out what is part of like the experience of players and people in it, but also thinking about why this world is special, or why this word is special, and why it's meaningful to this group of people. It's also a way of later on in the game, as you can imagine doing this over time, and some of you have, you can introduce some basic and fundamental parts of the way that language actually changes through examples that are intuitive to people, but that also are directly impacting the story. So it's language change, and the idea that there's a narrowing that may happen of a particular term for some reason that then informs a choice in the story and then propels that forward. And it's this kind of loop of, making language that then begets story, that then begets language and story, which I think is powerful and ultimately can leave people with this idea of, I'm going to go back, an artifact that they make, this non-physical artifact that you make by, virtue of playing. One of the things that's really cool is that people often will remember parts of their dialect or whatever they made up, and that can really bring them back to the table and immersion in it. This game has been translated into a number of languages at this point. And what's really cool is that I don't understand many of these languages that it's been translated into, but it's gone through a separate layer of, let's say, a filter at this point. This is an example. I just pulled this from YouTube of a dialect game in Japanese. Some of you will be able to read it. I can't. But on top of it, they're also making up terms that are particular to them and their particular play. And this is just an amazing game, interface and simulator that I wish that was more popular in some of the game communities I play in, because you can see all those avatars that are talking at various times. I love that this is like germinating different kinds of language play and doing so in a language independent way beyond the rules themselves being translated. Language is world building in different places around the world. Great. Next, I'd like to briefly talk to you about our game Sign, and maybe use this as a moment to really emphasize the point of play as co-creation. So Sign is a live action game. As opposed to a typical role-playing game where we might all gather together at a table and talk, in Sign you move around. And these games I love because they are embodied and there's so much somatic information that we have and that is deeply immersive. And so I love talking to VR designers, especially because I consider myself a LARPer. And LARP is the best form of gameplay. Definitively, I can say that objectively. This game is a LARP, but a lot of people maybe have other attachments to that word. Sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. It's a live action game where you move around. In Sign, Sign is a game that is inspired by a true story, which is one that is often covered in like a basic linguistics class because of what an amazing example it is of language birth. Sign is based on or inspired by the story of Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is a language that was born in modern times from children who were deaf children brought together to a school who themselves didn't have a single form of sign language that was present throughout the country, and instead through play, through interaction, through need, co-created one together. This is a language that exists today, is the official sign language of Nicaragua, and that even some of its very first speakers are still alive. And you think about just how timeless it can feel like to have inherited this language, the language you speak, and many languages you might speak from other people. And this is one that is so new and so rich at the same time. So in Sign, in this game, it's a game where you play out the idea of children who don't have shared sign language together, but instead are using sort of improvised gesture. And over the course of a 2-hour session, say, you are able to take a journey that brings you to a place of little understanding to some understanding together, and doing that through a way that is trying to embrace the idea of co-creating something together. What I like about this is that it taps into this idea of improvised gesture as another form of communication. It also thinks about being one vector to spread the story of what is the birth of a language in modern times, but also not being a simulation. I think that sometimes games really go awry when they try and use the word, let's say, empathy. This is not an empathy generating experience. I feel very weird about that word when it comes to gameplay. And I think games can be persuasive in ways that can be untrue as well. So this is not a simulation of that experience or anything like it. It's more game and interactivity as metaphor that then maybe helps the actual story stick with you or make you curious about it or lead you to it without trying to tell you any one thing about the experience or the people that were part of that story. One thing that has been interesting for us, one is to see this played all over, but also there's also the experience of seeing this played and where some form of improvised, let's say, sign is happening among players. And if I am watching it, I quickly don't know what is being communicated, even though other people do. It is also a game experience that we found that is welcoming of people who don't speak the same language, which is interesting. We've now seen this game played between, because improvised sign is a part of what this game is in the same way that maybe like improvised language is a part of what dialect is. We've had amazing games that involve, let's say, native sign speakers, native, people who don't share the same language, who are all part of a single game. But because this game is trying to take you through a communication, let's say, journey, they can interact in a way that's focused on communication, even though they don't share any of the same tools of it, because they're generating it together. Another thing about this game, I'd say, is that it's taken us as a game studio on a journey ourselves. Originally, we made this because of my background in linguistics and wanting to more deeply represent and think about different kinds of stories that we could tell. And very quickly, we knew we wanted to work with actual native speakers of this language. And so we have started a relationship with Nicaraguan Sign Language Projects. This is a charity that funds sign language education in Nicaragua, specifically supporting this language, but also is connected to some of the first linguists who documented it. And here you can see sort of a first iteration of what was sign as a PDF sort of back in the day. And this is a picture that my partner took in actually being in Nicaragua. So now, unfortunately, not me, the other half of Thorny Games got to go 2 times into the field with the Nicaraguan Sign Language Projects to actually kind of support sign language education and see where this language is actually working and thriving today. This is a picture of a dictionary that is being written and being accumulated in Nicaraguan Sign Language. I think this was taken in Bilwi, Nicaragua. And this is just the language in action that you can see. I think this is a story of Apollo that is being told in reference to the National Anthem, which was for the first time being translated from Spanish into ISN, which is the language itself. All of the proceeds from the physical version of this game go directly to support this sign language focused nonprofit. And it's definitely changed just how we think about games and relation with other people as we make things. Finally, I'd love to talk to you about games as community-driven care through a project about co-design that we did with a few people. So collaboration and co-creation has been a part of a lot of the things that we've talked about so far with partners, who are, fundamental to sharing their stories, to, actually enabling other people to create stories together. This is a project that we did where we wanted to directly inform a co-design team to make something that wouldn't be possible without many different people. So aphasia is the loss of language due to brain injury, oftentimes following a stroke. It has received some new attention in the media recently because Bruce Willis was public with his own diagnosis of aphasia, and that limiting his ability to continue to act in the same way that he did. I know that some of the aphasia folks that I have talked with have expressed gratitude at bringing additional attention to what is a really oftentimes invisible, underserved population of people. When someone has aphasia, it can be very dramatic in terms of what it does to how they interact with the world at large, their relationships, and actually getting adequate care is difficult, as you can imagine. And so many people with aphasia say that they have very extremely limited services that typically come from how they interact with the healthcare system. And aphasia can be chronic. And that means that you need to think about your own recovery and story in the long run versus what may actually be supported by insurance. And so there is a real need within the aphasia community to think about what are engaging ways of doing therapy practice, speech therapy at home on your own terms without a clinician present, and really in a way that is engaging and embracing your full playful human self. And so for this, games are an attractive thing to think about. You'll hear about gamifying everything. I feel like it's like there's different trends of this that go on, and I have a lot of feelings about that. Sometimes there's things that really don't, deserve or don't, fit well with what a gamification could look like. But this is one that I think has a lot of promise. One, because there is the potential to be therapeutic. There's basic actions within speech language therapy that are evidence-based that people can tackle. Their games can be flexible in formats and also made to be virtual and kind of meet the needs and the environment of different people. They're a lot cheaper than lots of other things, and they're directly engaging if you're designing well. And so altogether, this kind of initiative inspired a group of people, which Thorny Games was one, to think about how we could create a co-design team to tackle making games for people with aphasia that are based on therapeutic game mechanics. So it brought together speech language pathologists who are able to actually inform kind of what these evidence-backed behaviors are, aphasia community members who can represent their own experience, what's fun, the games that they're already playing and how they want to inform the games that we'll make together, and then professional game designers who can actually make scalable, playful systems. And this is what our team looked like through a grant that we received from the Innovation at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as Aphasia Recovery Connection, which is one of the largest aphasia community support groups in the country. We had other members of our team, as well as a bunch of professional game designers who've made a lot of great and interesting games that I would highly recommend you check out and will recommend after this talk, as well as researchers from Carnegie Mellon and us. So together we kind of formed this intrepid team where we said, we're going to make games. We have many different expertise. How do we do this? We're going to produce 3 prototype games, calling out what we believe to be sort of like these informed game principles that we think are possible to achieve within a game, and see what we can do. And one of the things you'll find in games in health perspective is there's often a temptation to overpromise what's possible. So understanding that these are prototypes that are made with this intention that aren't going to be like some panacea at the get-go was important for us. Thinking about co-design there, you get all of these different people that have different expertise coming together. You have to think about what it even means to make something together, how you go about doing that. So we had to design our co-design process. And that was not straightforward and was something that really needed to be thoughtfully done and iterated on. And it was necessary in order to make the kinds of things that we wanted to make, different people that really needed decision-making power at what ultimately comes out. But you needed to be thoughtful about people who, one, have never made games before, now going through a game development process, people who have different communication needs. What are we going to do to be able to make this process accessible and adaptable to that? And then people who need to make sure that the game mechanics that we're coming out with are actually functioning as evidence-backed speech language therapy inspired mechanics. So we ended up actually publishing on our co-design process and what we came up with. We made 3 different prototypes. I'm going to play for you, if this works, just one of these games in action. Has anyone played the game 1,000-Year-Old Vampire? Great. 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is a solo game that I highly recommend, where you are a 1,000-year-old vampire who forgets things and goes on big adventures in this immersive book. That designer is named Tim Hutchings, and Tim Hutchings joined our co-design team to make this game that you're going to see right now. This is a game called Do You See What I See? Playable on Zoom, where many different aphasia support groups were working, certainly within the pandemic, but also more permanently because people are located around the country. And the idea is like interaction at a distance. It sort of is a 20 questions language interaction that does some core things that are important with speech language therapy. I'm going to play a little portion of it just so you can see this interaction. If I can navigate and play. Great.
All right, who wants to be the chooser? I will. Awesome. Trish is the chooser. Remember, now we are guessers, and we can ask yes or no questions like, is it green or is it round? But we can't ask whose background is it behind. Let's get started.
Is it on a table? No. Is it a square? Yes. Is it on a wall? Yes. Is it a mirror?
Yay! And now, since Jill guessed and it's behind Jill, Jill can tell us the story of the mirror.
Well, I like mirrors because my grandson is 17 months old and he loves to look at himself. Of course.
Very proud of them. Right, T.
Anyway, so we go on to play more. And one thing that's really beautiful, I think, about this game is that it models question and answering and things like it. Aphasia will have different profiles. Different people will experience different difficulties, and it's more inclusive of that. But it also allows for interaction with location at a distance, right? We're like looking at other people's, backgrounds and what's in their home, even though we're separated, which is delightful in and of itself. And it gives an excuse for someone to share a personal story. So now we've seen this game and the games that came out of it used within aphasia support groups throughout the country. It's a high bar to ultimately prove out a game as a medical intervention. And there are actual companies, places that are doing these kinds of things right now that have gone through the hoops, and that games are a form of playable medicine, right, where they are given a prescription and people can, treat ADHD and things like it by playing games through the doctor, recommendation. And I think that like this experience-based, engaging playful medicine is a really exciting area, but it also is just delightful for a bunch of people to be able to interact together in a way that would be difficult entirely on their own. It's simple, but it's accessible, and it's been really neat to be a part of it. How do I move? There we go. These are just three different, let's say, principles that have informed a lot of what we make at Thorny Games. Language is world building, asking like, how can language be a game mechanic that forges connection between people? Play is co-creation. How can you empower people to be co-authors of stories and use a rule system to make different and engaging things together they wouldn't be able to make on their own? And games is community-driven care. How can games be part of the way that people care for each other and do it that is therapeutically, let's say, motivated, backed, or informed, and then think about being able to perform care on their own terms in their own lives. Thank you. I'm Kathryn. I'm here to chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts, what kind of games you're making, any questions you have, what excites you about games, why you came to this talk, all of those things. So you tell me.
So in the last one, like, is there any specific component that actually sort of try to solve that Aphasia disease? Like,
No.
why is it better than just like I'll let you guys talk?
In the last game, so none of these are meant to be, let's say, solutions, but speech language therapy has it's the kind of therapy that you would do with a professional that would lead you through exercises to help in your own journey of recovery if you're someone with aphasia. And what this game does, and what each of these kind of prototype games do, is to try and deploy very specific let's say, roles of language, of doing language, asking people to ask questions, yes or no, that are inviting of the kinds of interactions you might have in a therapeutic situation, but doing so within the context of a game. So playful, therapeutically informed, but not a solution in any sense. Yeah. Chaos. So the question, I think I'm supposed to repeat, the question was about process, and the answer was chaos, but there is a better answer than just that, but let's be honest. It's having an idea you really believe in. That is the biggest, I think, thing, because it is really hard to make something. Genuinely very, very hard. It takes so many hours, disappointments. One of the things I love about game design is that play testing is a very basic function about defining what success is. And really, I think that that should be true for most things, and often isn't to the degree that it is. And so the idea is with game design, you have to put it in front of people very quickly to see if it's doing what you intend it to do. And it's a humbling process where you think you are doing something and find you're doing something else, or you may be doing what you thought you were going to do, but it isn't fun. And so it is an evolution that way. But I think having a core idea of what is interesting and exciting that can get you through the ups and downs is a real big part of that. The other thing I'd say is that each of the games that we take on is often, let's say, inspired by either a mechanic or a story that wants to be told, and that we feel like that maybe we're the people to help tell, and that and then there's a process of, let's say, defining what is the smallest instantiation of that idea and prototype, and then putting that in front of people and communicating sort of the degree of bakedness that's there. It's like, okay, don't worry about this, but think about this, kind of coaching people almost through the feedback that you want, and then iterating that over time. And what can be really tricky, interesting, and that I've learned entirely just through doing thousands of hours of all of this is, hearing feedback from people because you're asking for it, and then receiving it, but also having opinions about it, in the sense that I'll always ask playtesters, like, tell me what your rose is about the experience, your thorn, like what you loved, what you didn't, what was hard for you. And I will always be building up a model internally of what I agree with and what I don't, because ultimately, we're the game designers that need to make choices. And that can just be tricky in general, because there's so many things I feel like you don't invite that level of feedback in at all stages. And so you have to be kind of true to your own vision or taste, while still always having the humbling feedback along the way. Yeah. Does anyone here make games? Somebody must make games. You all make games, no? Do you want to make games? Does anyone here want to make games?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't make games for a job. I feel like it's just like a thing I do when I'm bored,
Doesn't have to be a job.
Everything kind of a game.
And now you're talking my language, yeah. So
like I tell myself, oh, if I do this, I'll let myself do that. That's a game.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think kind of in sharing about my own professional background too, I also want to make the point that you can make games because you love to make them, and you don't need to think about this as some venture where you have a commercialized part of your life. I think too often we're always pushed that way when you take something seriously. You can take something really seriously and not think about it as in terms of economics at the same time. Yeah. Yeah.
Everything, games, I do design assignments that are well done.
I feel like that's really true. It's interactive. You're asking people to do things. You're trying to engage them. Yeah, sometimes you can get into this academic spiral where people actually they break out the question, what is a game? And that's oh, let's get a few drinks in us first, and then not use it to police what games are, is my feeling behind it. Yeah, I think that there's playful elements in so much of what is designed and interactive. Yeah.
So I feel like when I think of some games, usually there's some score,
Mhm.
just sort of predefined or something, and I'm trying to optimize that score. And there are many ways to do that, and that's the art. Like, if I understand correctly, like in your games, it's more like open world. You can do anything.
Yeah.
There's no clear, like, I don't know, measure of like how bold you do. You comment.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a great question, and one that that really informs different kinds of games. The games that we design are definitely ones that don't have a score behind them, and there isn't some win or loss condition. The only goal in playing these games is to tell an amazing story with a bunch of people at a table. Maybe they're friends, maybe they're strangers. Dungeons and Dragons, if people have heard of that game or have played it, is one game kind of within this sphere, and is the game that is maybe most well known within the role-playing space. There is some element of, let's say, leveling up your character and accumulating things that are a part of it, but a lot of that game is around storytelling that people are doing together. And there's been a golden age, let's say, of games in the space that are really rooted in storytelling, that are all about just inviting people who want to play together, but aren't actually concerned about winning, losing. And sometimes it's actually more fun to lose in these games. There's the term play to lose, which is great. Like, you want to be in a position where you are the one who is the fallen villain or the victim or whatever it may be. Like, you're playing out these different stories, and that can be more fun for you. And so once you break open the concept of, let's say, win, lose, or accumulate points, there really is a world of games, of which this is just one set of them, about collaboratively telling stories together. And so the fun in it is the experience of making something and telling something amazing with friends. Yeah.
This is from CS Garcia Martinez. Were your Aphasia playcasters and collaborators familiar with this sort of gameplay? And how did you find they adapted to it, if not?
Yeah. The folks with Aphasia who are part of our co-design team themselves had deep experience with games. One, D, who is one of the people who was playing, runs games as part of Aphasia Recovery Connection, trivia, bingo, I think. There's lots of games that are typically run by lots of aphasia support communities and just people with aphasia all over the country and world. So they were selected in part because they liked games and were interested in being a part of this co-design project. So they had that going for them. And I should say that the games that we made as a part of the Aphasia project aren't necessarily role-playing games or anything like this. They were their own standing, games that were the product of many different people coming together that aren't necessarily, codified into a particular category. And so the fun for them also reflected ultimately what those games became, and was probably informed by a lot of the games that they play in their life outside. I should say that if you're interested in that project more, we have a great webpage called aphasiagamesforhealth.com, and there's also community recommendations between or by some of our co-design team members with aphasia about games that they enjoy playing, why they enjoy playing them, where they play them in their lives, in addition to the games that we co-created together.
I was thinking about when you're talking about like points or win-loss and stuff like that. If you go to conventions like Gen Con or something, promote these kind of games, how do you reach that player who's more the Ameritrash or Euro?
Yeah.
How do you approach that too? Because I find that when I introduce like Dialect, people really like it, but yeah, they're not willing to try it to start because you're not moving pieces around the board.
Right.
How do you
Yeah. It's interesting too. So Gen Con is like one of the biggest tabletop convention games, certainly in the country, if not the world. And it's such an amazing place to be. It's in Indianapolis, and it is so big. And it's basically everything that is analog gaming altogether. So if it's non-digital, it is there. And so you get this like complete mismatch of cultures that come of play culture. There's like the people who are super into board game, and like people who are super into wargaming, people who are super into LARPing, people who are super into indie storytelling, and they're all together. There's no great, comparison that I have for it. It's like, imagine having a music convention, right? Where there's just music there. And you're like, okay, and so there's a lot of different opinions about what play is and what fun is, and like the different, let's say, communities that people come out of. I met this community actually at Gen Con through something called Indie Games on Demand. And they play these kinds of games. And often like people will have their own ways of getting to them. One of the things that I think that's so exciting about it is that, well, I'm a board gamer and like actually like started off playing a bunch of board games, interested in points. I have lots of opinions about like what are great board games, things like that. But these kinds of games often attract people who have opted out of other kinds of play. Competitive play, super fun. I'm in the mood. I'm also competitive. And you can like lean into that in different ways. But there's many people who don't fall within, let's say, the archetype of someone who might walk into a game store, that then when they see these games and the topics that they might cover, and I mean that inclusive of the whole, let's say, genre of these games, not just our games, are more motivated to play, see themselves as players. And that to me is so exciting, especially when you get like people who wouldn't think of themselves as storytellers or are beginners or would never have approached, let's say, even Dungeons and Dragons or something like it, and find a home here. But it's like there's a tension between all of these games where like you'll go into a game store and that might be built around a niche person who like is more interested in certain kinds of gameplay, right? And has a history with it. And maybe they're curious about expanding that, or maybe they aren't. And that's fine. You know, there's no value judgment that I have over that. But it just means that sometimes the banner of game store can really welcome and exclude different people. And so it can be like that at Gen Con too. But I've found the weirdest and most wonderful stuff at Gen Con. And we run these regularly as well. So it's great.
Yeah, so I had two kind of separate comments. One was like the whole idea of like therapy as gaming, or gaming as therapy. And like, I wonder whether you've thought about like expanding that. So like just within the SLP domain, like for example, one of my best friends is like an SLP for like 3-year-olds, right, like preschoolers who are having like language deficits or disorders. I feel like designing a game for that population would be like a completely different task. And I wonder if you've ever thought about doing that, or even like things that aren't like directly language related, like a game that could help with like anxiety or depression or something. Yeah. And then yeah, the second very unrelated comment is like, so I'm like a theoretical linguist, so like I'm like a grammar person. I wonder like, you know, I played a little bit of dialect with my colleagues, right? And we loved it, but I wonder like if there's like a space for a game that's like even nerdier, that has like actual like, you know, grammar and like
totally. Yeah, you can say that there's a tension there when it comes to like something that is, let's say, approachable by many people versus you know, someone who wants to truly lean into that. In fact, so the book, if you look at it, it has a chapter by someone named David Peterson in it. And David Peterson is a famous conlanger who made Dothraki, among other constructed languages. And it is what we, you know, you never know who your players are going to be when you make a game. And so part of the reason it's called Dialect is because I just knew that like conlangers who would play this would go like, that's not a language that you're making or whatever, you know, it's just like, let's just cut that off at the pass a little bit. And then also welcome in some of the folks that, of which I'm a part of too. I'm a conlanger. But I completely agree with you that there's like a different element. And maybe if this is an opening for a conversation, which I think is to go into constructed language, at that point, if you really want to get into the, you know, guts of, you know, making decisions about how language could work or how you deviate from whatever is the base language that you could get into. And I love the idea of making an advanced version of that. But then just to answer your first question, or to just comment on the first thing that you say, I agree with you that there's so many different places where I think that games could be a really interesting and engaging way of addressing what is already existing, let's say therapy practice, but made intentionally, maybe with people that have skills about playable systems and how to play test and things like it. A lot of times I'll say that like there's difficulty in getting funding. Like this was a funded project through health funding and grants that came out of it. And really legitimizing this as a form of what is research and development, I think is part of the work there. And it's happening. I mean, like now it's trite to say that games are the dominant form of entertainment. It's like, when's the last time you read a book? Be honest, right? I mean, I read kind of, but like there's lots of stuff that like games now just are permeating everything when it comes to culture and, you know, how we interact playfully. And so I think that funding will catch up, hopefully. Yeah.
Just gonna say to add on, like, Wingspan made birds popular in popular culture. So there's a space for nerdy games.
Yeah.
Do it, have a game that is like actual like, developing a contemplation.
Yeah.
How can you make that like actually palatable to someone?
There's some interesting games. I haven't played it. There's one, I think it's actually called, there's some games that are meant to teach you about learning a particular language that try and like get you to interact with the bits and pieces of this. Maybe linguists will know more than me too. There's a game about learning Japanese. I think it's maybe even called Japanese, the game. I've never played it. There actually, I have to talk about briefly a game called Magicians, which is a role-playing game where you play like students in a magical setting. But in order to cast spells, you are also playing this game because you want to learn how to pronounce Korean. And the way that you cast spells is by talking into the speech language recognition part of your phone. And if it recognizes it, you have correctly cast it. And so it's very cute and meant to help Korean students or Korean language students.
So we're at the top of the hour. So our reservation of this room ends now, but what we're gonna do is anyone who's interested in staying, now the formal part of the talk has ended, we're gonna go downstairs to the cafe area right in front of Teaches, kind of convene at like the big table there and continue question and answer for anyone who's interested. And Ashlyn will be back soon with food from Majani, which is a vegan soul food restaurant in South Shore, which is one of my favorites. And yeah, so Ash will be back probably in the next 15 minutes or so with food for everyone who's here, who wants to stay. But let's thank Kathryn again for such an
Thank
amazing
you.
talk.
Thanks for having me.